Hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting in the meeting room. I think many of you are now through and we're going to start. I think we'll have a few more guests joining us over the next couple of minutes. My name is Rebecca Starford. I'm the publishing director at Kill Your Darlings magazine. I'm actually joining you tonight from overseas. I'm based in France at the moment, but I'm sure as many of you know, most of KYD's work takes place in Melbourne, now headquarters in North Fitzroy. And so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of that land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm really delighted to be here tonight in this event with my good friend Hannah Kent, and I'll introduce Hannah in a moment. But just a little bit of an outline for this evening. This is the first event of this kind for KYD, and I hope it'll be the first of many, but our conversation tonight with Hannah will go for about 30 minutes or so. We've got lots to cover, and then we'll open up the chat for questions from you. So please have a think about anything you'd like to ask, or if we don't cover a particular aspect of screenwriting that interests you, and throw your question in the chat and we'll get to it after the 30 minutes or so. But if you could hold off those questions until the end of our conversation, that'd be really helpful, so we can scroll through and hopefully get through as many of them as possible. We are recording the session tonight as well, and we'll be sending that through to those RSVPs who couldn't attend. Now let's introduce Hannah, who probably needs no introduction to all of you here tonight. Hannah is the award-winning best-selling author of Burial Rites, The Good People and Devotion. Hannah's original feature film, Run, Rabbit, Run, starring Sarah Snook of Succession fame, was directed by Daina Reid, who was also the director of The Handmaid's Tale, and it was produced by Carver and XYZ Films. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival last year in 2023, where it was acquired by Netflix. Hannah is also the screenwriter for the film adaptations of her novels The Good People and Devotion, and she's also the co-founder of Kill Your Darlings. And she has recently launched a new KYD online writers course called Screenwriting for Beginners. Hannah, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Beck. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. I'd like to add, too, that I'm speaking to you on Paramount country. I'd like to extend my respect and acknowledgement to elders past and present here today.
Thanks, Hannah. So I suppose one of the things that many of us tonight will be really curious to know about, given that you have now had the screenplay Run, Rabbit, Run produced and made into a film, and that you're working on your other projects as well, is what was your early relationship to film in particular? Were you someone who was a real film buff as a teenager? Obviously books and novels have been your passion from childhood, but were you also, you know, very much there watching many films and really enjoying consuming them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's funny because I do describe myself as a bookworm, and I think books were probably the first way that I accessed, you know, narrative as a young kid. But yeah, definitely growing up and definitely in my teen years, I think I just loved storytelling of all forms. I really loved theatre, and that probably came on afterwards. I was, for a long time, I thought I was going to be a poet, and then I changed my mind and thought I'd be a short story writer. And then by the time I was at university, I was really interested in becoming a playwright. And the reason why it was playwright and not doing anything for screen was just because I didn't understand the avenues into that industry. But I loved films. I loved films for their storytelling. I was like, I went through this period of time, probably, you know, in my late teens, when I was trying to think of myself as someone very serious about, you know, capital A arts, that I got really into, you know, anything with subtitles, basically. So, which was great, actually. It was a wonderful education. But yeah, so I've always really enjoyed quite dramatic storytelling, storytelling which centers character particularly.
Yeah, wonderful. And many of our guests tonight will have already seen Run, Rabbit, Run, the film that was made adapted from your screenplay, but there may be some who haven't already seen it. Can you tell us a little bit, just a brief overview of the story, which will give us some context to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of how you came to write it?
Yeah, well, Run, Rabbit, Run, as it stands today, as you can watch it on Netflix, is a psychological thriller which looks at a woman who is a doctor. She is someone for whom she's someone for whom I think life has not always been controlled. So she is someone for whom she's someone who seizes onto the relationships around her. She's estranged from her mother. We learn more about the reasons of why that is the case. And she is divorced, but she has a young daughter. She's thriving in her career. Everything is in place. And then on her daughter's 7th birthday, Mia, who is her daughter, starts having strange experiences. She's a happy kid, but she starts to become really upset at school. She starts to become quite hostile towards Sarah, our protagonist. And then eventually when Sarah and the teachers sort of push Mia a little bit further and try to understand why she is, you know, sort of acting out so out of behavior, so acting out of character, we learn that she is missing someone, that she initially doesn't really know who it is, and then eventually says she's sort of says that Sarah isn't her mother at all, that she's missing another family, that she is someone else entirely. And around the same time, Sarah too is being contacted by the carers of her mother, who want to arrange a meeting. And when Mia hears about this, she is adamant that she goes too. And from there, we have this excavation of the past, of an incredible amount of trauma. And we also have the dissolution to a great extent of Sarah's own, her sense of control, and also her, you know, psychological wellness.
Yeah, thanks for that summary. That's terrific. And I mean, of course, the way that the film, you know, unfolds, you know, the way that Mia begins to sort of manifest, you know, what seem like messages or her own kind of psychological issues, and how that's paired with Sarah, the protagonist's, you know, deep unsettlement, both with this situation, but also the past, you know, rising to the surface is so brilliantly done in the film. We'll talk a little bit more about Sarah, the main character, who's played by Sarah Snook, a little bit later, I hope. But what struck me about the film, you know, it shares many traits with your novels, which might sound a bit strange given we've just sort of heard that summary. But, you know, we've got very complex female characters whose pasts are again intruding on their presence, with fairly problematic, you know, outcomes. We've also got the rich rendering of setting. Setting plays such a central part in the film, in a very kind of haunting and evocative way. But it's a novel that's very, it's a screenplay that's very contemporary, you know, very much of the now, in terms of, you know, character and the lives that they're living. What was it like? You know, your books have been set to date, your novels have been set to date, you know, these historical settings. What was it like to move from the past into the present? Did that feel liberating? Was it intimidating? I mean, what was that like for you?
Well, it happened in a very natural way. So it wasn't as intimidating as perhaps it had I been approached with, you know, a pitch to write a present day. You know, no one came to me and said, we want you to, you know, write a psychological thriller about a woman essentially being consumed with guilt in contemporary Australia. I would have been like, that's not my wheelhouse at all. But I came into the project from much more sort of from familiar territory, which is reading about something from real life, which I found deeply fascinating. And then through a series of conversations, realizing that this had particular relevance, or just kind of finding it's like heat seeking, you know, whenever you have this new idea, whether it be a character or an event or, you know, a question, sometimes you just need to talk about it or just to feel it out a little bit. And you just find the things that feel full of life, you know, that I think Charlotte Wood calls it heat seeking. Sometimes I liken it to it's like you're putting fingers on a project and finding out where the pulse is. And by the time that I was thinking about this particular premise, which is what would it be like to have a child who is essentially reporting, you know, memories of a previous existence, which is something that happens in the real world and which had sort of led me down this particular rabbit hole. It felt like it was a really good opportunity to explore questions of motherhood, and they just felt particularly acute within a contemporary setting rather than a historical one. Originally, when I happened across this idea, you know, what would it be like as a parent of a child who's sort of disowns you as a parent and starts to mourn for a life that you know they never lived? I was thinking of it within a historical setting. I was thinking of it actually as a novel. But that was around the time that I met Anna and Sarah, who are the producers at Carver, and that was what they were interested in. And then in consequent conversations, it became very clear to us for that reason that no, actually, this is a great this is a great setup to explore, ideas of monstrosity within motherhood, ideas of guilt within motherhood and parenthood more widely. And it just felt like a very natural fit by that time. But yeah, it does, I guess, ostensibly it does look completely different for me. But I really appreciated not having to do as much research, honestly. That's probably the main thing. It felt very freeing just to be able to sit down and come up with stuff without having to,
Yeah.
I don't know, learn about how people dressed in the 19th century or something before I could write a scene.
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand that. That's really interesting. So you had the seed of the idea was there, and then you're in consultation with the producers is how you came to further develop it. Which I suppose for many emerging screenwriters might not necessarily be that trajectory, but it seemed that you had that, that there was enough there anyway to be kind of sustaining the project had you not had that conversation at that stage too, that was that kernel of the exploration of the concept of the motherhood and in this case monstrous mother figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite a question mark, because I guess there is so much ambiguity as well in the film as to Sarah's real kind of culpabilities around what eventually happens. I hope that we could, we'll jump back, hopefully jump back to Sarah as well, but I'm really curious too. So the nuts and bolts of screenwriting. So you mentioned the producers as well, coming in at an early stage. But I suppose we have, at KYD, we write many articles and explore the routines and processes of novelists in particular, or essay writers, in particular prose writers. But I think how screenwriters sit down and write a screenplay is probably opaque to many of us, in terms of the length of time of a project or the kind of the building blocks of the project. Would you be willing to share a little with us how it all came to come together, and maybe some of the ways that process was surprising or different or challenging to you, given your novel writing background?
Well, it was completely opaque to me too when I had this opportunity. And I recognized that the reason I got an opportunity to write for film largely came from having written in other genres, having written fiction. I was approached by Carver because they had read, I think at that stage, The Good People had just come out. They certainly read Burial Rites. And they thought that, in their words, there was a visual sensibility to my writing. And I think that comes from, no matter what I'm writing, whether it's poetry or any of the other things, published or unpublished, that I've written, I do like to be able to see it for myself. And so a novel in many ways is already like a movie in my head. I need to be able to see it in order to write it. So perhaps that's something that they picked up. But they approached me, they got my email address somehow and contacted me and said, look, we enjoy your writing. Would you ever be interested in writing for screen? And I mean, it's gotten me in some sticky situations before, but I think I do have a propensity, and maybe it's the student mentality of just putting my hand up for everything, being like, yes, absolutely, would love to do that. And I sincerely would love the opportunity to write for screen too. Although at the back of the mind, I was thinking, I have no idea how this might happen. And I was hoping I might pick that up just through meeting with them. And then, so we caught up for coffee as much just to meet one another. And the more, as an aside, the more I do screenwriting, the more I realize how much time is spent in this. Networking is not necessarily the right word for it, but I think it's such a intense thing to do with other people. I mean, it's a highly collaborative, and I think there are many more meetings set up essentially just to make sure that you can work with one another. I think that's what producers spend a lot of time doing, is trying to sort of get the right team. So I met with them, I guess, so they could see what I was like, and also so I could ostensibly pitch them some ideas, and I did. I pitched them about 6 failed short stories, which I thought would look good on film, and they were incredibly patient and kind. And, after I did that, and I say this to sort of say, just because you don't necessarily win the pitch meeting, it doesn't necessarily mean, it's the end of things. So I pitched them my 6 terrible ideas, and they said, look, anyway, it's been lovely to meet you. Stay in touch if there's anything else that comes up. And then it was just as we were finishing our coffees and they were asking me what my next book might be about, that I started to tell them about this amazing documentary I had seen about a young boy, 5-year-old, living in Glasgow all his life, who was mourning, had ever since birth, had spoken of another family which lived on an island in the Outer Hebrides, to the point that when he was 5, he would sort of disowned his mother, wasn't acknowledging her, was missing his other mother, was missing his other family. And the creators of the documentary ended up taking him over to this particular island. and you know, followed his directions that he was able to say. It was completely uncanny, completely sort of supernatural. But watching this documentary, I'd been really fascinated with his mother. She was a single mother. She had other children. She was sort of, you know, just trying to make ends meet. And she had this child who was in extreme emotional distress. And I thought, what an interesting person, because you could see how the toll it had taken on her to, you know, try and raise a child and connect with a child who was sort of insisting on alienating himself from her. And I was explaining this to the producers, and they said, let's talk about that. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And then I eventually kind of came clean and I said, look, I haven't written anything for screen, you know, like I'd love the opportunity, but you guys might have to, you know, help me here. And they said, look, it starts as just as this, like it's they're producers who are invested in creative development, which means that they're used to working with people who haven't necessarily worked for the screen. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but their job is getting ideas off the ground and sort of shaped into a story. So our initial meetings were just that, just talking about story. What is interesting about this? What is it about this potential character, this mother? Why, what sort of things can we explore within her? What is she like, you know? What does she want, and how was she stopped from getting that? And how do we play that out within this particular context of a child reporting memories of a previous existence?
What fruitful conversations to have in that context as well. That sounds incredible. And so then the process, I don't want to go into the minutiae too much, but the process then was you went away and began to write the script itself, or was it treatment sort of put together and sort of pitched back to them and that back and forth process?
There was some documents that I needed to put together. Again, I was like, I don't know what that is. They asked me for a very brief synopsis, like a one-page synopsis. And that was mainly so that they could apply for funding to then pay me as a writer so that we could work out the story together. So they assured me that it probably would change, but as far as I could see it, to just write out a synopsis that they could use for their pitching document. We also, as part of that pitch, put together a bunch of interviews where we spoke about what we wanted to explore, what was interesting about the premise of this idea, how we wanted to work with one another. That was another big aspect of that funding application. And as a result of receiving that funding, then I was able to go away and write a screenplay. And eventually I said to them, what do I do? And they said, look, which is incredibly generous of them. They said, just write a screenplay as a novelist. And that was the best thing they could have told me. It meant that I could do a lot of description, which, you know, they knew I learned would eventually be completely, you know, just distilled to a few lines. But what they were essentially saying was explore character in the way that is most familiar to you. And then from that process, it took probably about 5 years to get to the current form of screenplay. And people came in and on that, and we had feedback from funding bodies, we had feedback from people who were interested in investing. And I learned very quickly that, you know, from draft to draft, a screenplay is this ever evolving thing, not even just in terms of evolving and becoming better and becoming more polished, but changing continually, you know, changing in its points of emphasis, changing in its slight approach to character, changing in dialogue. You know, when we were looking at casting, it changed again. We went through sort of 3 major sort of casting stages, and because of COVID and conflicting schedules, which I learned is a massive part of casting, and because that was so disruptive, we went from having sort of the role finally played by Sarah Snook. Initially, we had, you know, Elizabeth Moss down for that, and so after meeting with Elizabeth Moss, and the director had come on board for that particular meeting, and she's saying, I've worked with Elizabeth before on Handmaid's Tale. She's the actress who can give a look, you know, she just looks, and so much is said. So because we thought that she was going to be in it at that stage, because the schedules were not yet conflicted, we just scratched out a bunch of dialogue. So that was an incredible learning process, was realizing that it's different to a book and that you just try to get to the best version of itself. With a screenplay, you're just it's just about placing weight in different places according to who else is then involved and what their vested interests are and abilities are.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. It's a kind of a living entity that never really, the editing never stops, which the part of me sounds slightly nightmarish, but you know, is so understandable because of that collaborative nature as well, which is again something. Was that something that was difficult to, or maybe not necessarily difficult, but how did it feel adapting to that process? Because when, as a novelist, your editorial team that you work with is very small, but when it comes to all of the components that make up the production of a film, the screenwriter, important as they are but one. And working closely, I know that you worked quite closely with the director too. What was it like to receive that feedback, go in, adjust it, and working in a very different kind of manner? Was it an adjustment?
It was an adjustment. I think the biggest adjustment happened at the beginning because I wrote the first draft and I was like, look, I think there's problems. And they said, send it. And I said, oh, but it's just a first draft. And they're like, yeah, we know, we need to see it. And I mean, I'm someone who I will work on something for 2 years before like telling someone what I'm working on. So to have that, I felt incredibly vulnerable. And also I felt an incredible sense of shame because I didn't think that it was worthy of the standard of quality, like the standard of work or the quality of work that I normally hold myself to. You know, this is my first attempt at a screenplay and I have to show these like professional producers. But again, I guess I've learned now that you can trust these people are very used to working things up from ground, like, working things to an acceptable standard from the ground up. They're used to seeing things in every conceivable stage. And so I really benefited from their kindness and generosity. I also worked for a few drafts in. They also asked me if I would like to work with an editor, which was something I didn't realize. So this is essentially someone who can come, a freelancer who comes in and just, she was a wonderful woman and she came and sat in my house, sat in my little study with me for about 3 days, and we broke up the screenplay as it was then into scenes, and she really helped me understand things that I now have spoken about in the course, particularly about what I would have then called formula, but now I understand to be standard structure for a film, like 3-act structure. What's happening in this scene? Where do we end? What are the changes happening? And that was incredibly useful to kind of explode out the screenplay. And at that stage, we didn't have the rabbit. And it was as a result of doing this work with her that we realized we needed a physical sort of emblem of the catalyst of the changes which are occurring within the relationship between Sarah and her daughter, and also in terms of Sarah and her mother and Sarah's own psychological state. And we just came upon it. It was like, she was like, what if something strange happens? Just throw something at me. And I said, what if we get home and they arrive back home and there's a rabbit on the doorstep? And it was so kind of weird and strange that we were just like, yeah, we really like it. Let's just work with it. And it just kind of seemed to work on every level. So she taught me a great deal too about incorporating symbolism, which you necessarily need in a visual form of storytelling. So yeah, I learned a lot from her. I had the option of continuing to work with her, but essentially because I'm someone who does prefer, I don't have any real, certainly at that stage, any real experience of collaborative writing. And I felt confident after that to be able to continue on my own. So that's what we did. But it was great. It was like having an intensive workshop, and that was facilitated by the producers.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it seemed to me, I'm sort of combining a couple of questions here. When I rewatched Run yesterday, I was struck by, I suppose, the sparseness and the efficiency of what I interpreted as a viewer as the script. There isn't. It seemed to me anyway, not a hell of a lot of dialogue. As we go scene by scene, there are often scenes of silence, or at least no dialogue, and the work of the other filmic elements there to produce, extraordinary effect, tension, mood, suspense, fear. And of course, Sarah herself, this is a multi-character story, but she carries, so much of the narrative and does, I suppose, in terms of how the narrative is told, the storytelling, she does that heavy lifting of, moving us through the course of the story and scene by scene because of, the other primary relationship she has with her daughter. So, the daughter has limited agency, I guess, in terms of what she can be doing scene by scene. But it seemed to me, as I was watching, I was like, think about Sarah as a character as we just see the tip of the iceberg, really, at least initially. And then we kind of, I'm mixing metaphors here, but, the iceberg is rising, or, we're peeling back layers. But as the film progresses, but of course, for you as a writer, you've mapped this all out, presumably long before. I mean, what kind of work are you doing in terms of the development of character off the page as such? And then what are the processes very, very briefly, if it's possible to answer this, what processes do you undergo to then feed that backstory through? Because, you know, as we've mentioned about the storyline, so much of her past is impacting and driving this present storyline, and it's that balance is so fraught and you know, needs to kind of strike right. So how did you do that?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's a film where, I mean, Sarah's in every scene. We're completely limited to her point of view. And that's necessary because her point of view becomes, you know, her understanding of the world is something which is particularly relevant towards the end, without having any spoilers. You know, depending on what we believe of her is what we believe of what is happening around her, because it is limited. But I mean, in film, you don't have access to that interior space like you do as a novelist. So coming to it fairly cold, it was actually really enjoyable. It was like, okay, I have this woman in a position of stability. How do I convey her stability? How do I convey that this is someone who needs to have everything just so, who needs to feel like she's in control of her own life, and is future facing? You know, she doesn't want to look at the past. That's locked off to herself. How do I convey that? Like, how would I? Yes, there's dialogue, but I mean, so much of to convey that in dialogue would be telling and would be dissatisfying for an audience. One of my favorite ever scenes, in fact, many of them come from the wonderful film by Kate Shortland in Somersault, where I feel like so much is conveyed about that central character, Heidi, through, I mean, there's very little dialogue in that film too, but I loved it because I felt like I could really understand where she was at. And so it was a matter of thinking, okay, well, how do you prepare your food if this is something, if there's an exchange between her daughter, what's happening? What is her work environment like? I mean, so much of what was written to convey these things ended up being cut, sometimes to my knowledge, sometimes not. Sometimes it happened after, like in post-production. And then as she starts to really be troubled and to struggle with her senses, like her own trauma, her sense of guilt, you know, her deep secret that she thinks that she might be a monster, you know, or she wonders if her daughter, who is no longer seemingly loving her, actually thinks of her as a monster. When she starts to sort of doubt reality, how do you convey that self-loathing, but also that frustration with your child? And I remember some of the best conversations I had were with Daina, the director, when she came on board. And Daina was such a fantastic, I mean, she's such a fantastic, let's lay everything out on the table. Let's just talk about it. I want something strange. It's like, give me an eerie instance, no dialogue of this woman, like essentially, you know, losing her mind. And we came up with some great stuff, you know, that also by the stages we were incorporating slightly more supernatural elements. She'd be like, I want a spooky one. And so we, you know, then you have scenes in the film. There's a scene where one of my favorite scenes is when Sarah, who is mourning her father, steps into a box of his clothing, which she's been reluctant to go through, and sort of wraps the jumper around her, and then sort of speaks to herself in her dad's voice. That was something that came out of a conversation with Daina when we were like, let's convey her grief, but also let's just make this, we want spooky grief. So these are the sorts of, I was like, what if she does this? What if she does that? And then, so a lot of it was spitballing, and this was late stage. This was like 3 years in when we're coming up with these scenes. So, yeah, it was such an ad hoc process, really, when you think of it like that. But at the time, it just felt like, no, we're drilling down to something. It felt highly intuitive in some regards, and in some other points we were also very mindful of this particular structure. So we were like, no, we need to hit this particular beat. We want to freak people out here. There's another scene, it's not really giving anything away, when they're driving along and a bird just hits the windscreen, and it's a big sort of jump scare. And I mean, so much of a jump scare that when it premiered at Sundance, I flew out of my seat, even though I knew it was coming, and everyone around me was like, you wrote this. But that was, you know, but you just come up with, sometimes Daina would be like, I'm going to give you this problem, or I'm going to give you this to solve. You go away, you come back to me in a week. And I would just list, I'd be like, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. I'd give them 6 different options. And then she would be like, let's write out 2 of those. And then I would, and then we'd pick the one. And sometimes we'd revert back to the other. So it was this very sort of, as much as the screenplay is this thing, there were like 50 other screenplays that were also written. You know, you could cobble together another 10 from all the different scenes that were written to try and accommodate these particular needs surrounding character, these particular attempts to sort of have something, you know, symbolically portrayed to you as an audience member.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, that's just, again, that the collaborative nature of it is so fascinating. And I think for many of us, it's, you know, who perhaps come from a more traditional prose background, working with novels or memoirs, it can seem a little daunting, that prospect, but also such a wonderful, liberating experience to, you know, how you described a little earlier about having the capacity to send through work, and it's a live sort of entity that can be edited, and that, you know, it's not a kind of judgment, that there's a lacking of judgment there, but more of a mining for really great material and looking to develop that more. It's just such an interesting way of working, and is a little bit different from that traditional kind of public book publishing approach.
Massively different. It's hugely dynamic, but I think initially that's what frightened me about it. And then when I realized, oh, I can just say a bunch of ideas, and they not necessarily have to like be like, oh, we don't like that one, or we like it, they're just gonna be like that one. As soon as I sort of realized that it is this kind of highly collaborative, continually changing, and knowing as I send out these ideas and they agree on them, that they might also be changed, having that sort of understanding made me suddenly really, really enjoy it, because so much of, I mean, it's a performance dance, you know, it's like trying to choreograph a dance, whereas for a novel, sometimes for me at least, feels just like, you know, chipping away at a block of marble, trying to reveal the story within. It's a lot more slower, and the changes feel a lot more permanent, whereas with a film, it's not that at all.
I like interpretive dance, performative dance,
There you go.
the right genre of screenwriting.
Yeah.
We're going to convert everyone with that analogy. We're going to throw open to questions from our audience. Please send them through on the chat. I've got other questions, so I'll just keep an eye on the chat and shoot through those that come through. Don't be shy. Anything's up for asking about the nuts and bolts and the question. You mentioned Sundance before. I'm just going to kind of leap forward and I'll leap back again. What was the experience like of watching the film that you wrote in that environment at this extraordinary, prestigious film festival? Like,
yeah, I mean, it was incredible.
I mean, I know you got scared, but of the own film. But once you got over, you know, the frights.
Yeah, I don't like scary movies. I feel like I should say that's actually really traumatic. There'd be lots of times where they would send me away to watch other horror films, and like I have nightmares still to this day about them. Some of them I just read the screenplays of, because I'm like, I can't subject myself to that. Don't tell them I did that. But I yeah, it was wonderful. It's an incredible festival. Just being in that sort of environment was, you know, incredibly, you know, it was a heady experience. Seeing the film was really interesting. It was part of the Midnight Selection, which is a particular part of Sundance, which they where they feature horror films, psychological thrillers, scary films, basically. So they screen them at midnight. And so seeing it that first time at midnight in this very old historic theatre was incredibly exciting. It was also really intimidating, because basically the whole crowd were critics. So I felt that they were receiving the film in a slightly, you know, it was such very sort of conscious watching. And then we got to go out to a university where it was screened in a very large auditorium. And the sound was a lot better, which made a massive difference, because it was contemporary and they had good speakers, and massively different. I felt like I was in, you know, like a megaplex sort of cinema here, with everyone laughing and screaming, and in many ways that was much more enjoyable than the sort of, you know, honorific screening at this prestigious cinema. It was really lovely to kind of sit in this crowd and hear people, you know, behind me saying, oh my God, you know, that was really, really exciting. But yeah, it was, and also hearing that Netflix acquired it before it had even screened too. So it was, it was a really intense couple of days and really enjoyable. But I mean, as a writer, you're really super low down on kind of that hierarchy of sort of stardom that those festivals also celebrate and really enjoy, which was great. I really enjoyed that aspect of it, because you felt like you were there as this kind of interloper, and no one really wanted you to perform.
You did have to do your photo call though, didn't you? But did you have to do
so there were some photo calls, and you just feel like a complete idiot, honestly. Like everyone's like, yeah, hi, and it's, you know, it's very I think the American culture around these sorts of things is slightly different to my very limited experience of that in Australia. But yeah, you basically are held back by a bunch of people, and then they're like, you go and you walk through this little thing of, past the background, and you're trying to wear something nice, and you're trying to remember what to do with your hands while a bunch of people take photos of you. But it's also like a machine, and after you, there's another bunch of people. It's crazy.
Wonderful. That's thank you for sharing that experience.
Yeah,
I've always
Google
been,
my very awkward,
yeah, well, it could be your next author pick as you on the red carpet. So we haven't got any messages through. I'm hoping that the chat is working correctly. Apologies if we are having some problems. As I mentioned, this is our first time hosting an event of this nature, but I've got plenty to ask Hannah as well. So do send through if you do have any specific questions. I mentioned in your bio note that you're currently working on the adaptations of your other two most recent novels.
Yeah.
How's that experience been different in terms of when you wrote Run Rabbit Run? I mean, obviously this is your own source material.
Yeah.
So is there other things that have kind of been more challenging or different in that process?
Yeah, both projects have been very different, I think, in that I mean, they're both ongoing, so I'll try to say as much as I can about them. But I think so much of it comes down to, so the nature of so much of my experience comes down to the producers, particularly that I work with, and their mode of working, how much they want to check in, how responsive they are to other people's feedback, particularly investor feedback. I mean, it was interesting working with Daina with Run Rabbit Run, that we actually wrote about 3 different endings. And right sort of to the 11th hour, I think they shot multiple endings as well, because there was
Okay.
particular international bodies who were involved in the film and had an invested interest who were sort of in disagreement about what they thought would go well in their markets. And that was something that it was really great working with that particular team, because we ended up sticking with our favorite ending that we felt was most true to the story. And that wasn't my fight to have. That was something that was sort of battled out amongst the producers and the director too. But that was, that was a wonderful, I was able to say my piece to them, and I felt, incredibly well supported within that environment. So when it comes to adapting your own work, when you're looking at changing multiple scenes, just getting rid of characters, I try to really, in both instances, I've tried to really divorce myself from the source material. And I think of it as another opportunity to write the same story, or to try and honor the soul of that original story, but it's a complete rewrite. It's like I've been given a second chance and I can do things completely differently. And I think having it in that light is freeing and exciting, because it places the emphasis back on creativity. Now I have, all these different tools to play with. How am I going to, bring to life 19th century Ireland? How am I going to convey the lives of these particular women when I don't have access to their interior thoughts, when I can't justify the things that they do because I can't access their reasoning? How do I show that reasoning? And sometimes, so in the case of the good people, that's necessitated because I don't have access to that interior world, and therefore actions become more heightened, more dramatic, perhaps more easily to condemn. I've necessarily had to change a lot of the plot and change a lot of the character. And that's happened over probably about 5 years or so. And again, through largely conversation, but working with Devotion, the director has been on board from day dot. So that's also changed it, because I've said, if I wrote it like this, what would you? And she's just like, oh, that's my problem. Like, that's my job to interpret. So that's actually been lovely, having that kind of reassurance right from the outset.
How interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's probably key though for both projects, is essentially just thinking, no, you have these characters, you have something of this story. How do you sort of keep the feeling of it, but go completely, but you're writing it again, The book never happened. You're writing this for the first time. I don't actually really read the books. I just kind of go from my memory.
Oh wow, yeah, that's really interesting. How that you don't go go back to that source material explicitly. I mean, obviously it's your own source material, but you're kind of working from the memories and the development of the character and all those building blocks again. We have a question. We're fast running out of time, so I want to get to a question. So this is from Linda. She says, "Hi Hannah, what do you think makes some ideas more suited to screenplay rather than a novel?" Excellent question.
That is a really good question. Honestly, and especially the way the industry seems to be going now, I think so many novels are being adapted to screenplay. And I know that it's a massive part of what producers are looking for. So many of them are reading novels for content. So, you know, in many ways, I think a novel, what is suitable for a screenplay is often also suitable for a novel. I think it then comes down to which do you want to write. And I think, at least initially, and I mean, in fact, I know some producers are recommending writers write the novel first and then write the screenplay, which seems like this protracted thing. It has been said to me before, but I think it depends on how you work as a writer, and everyone works incredibly differently. So there is no one answer, but a part of it is intuitive. Part of it is also seeing how complicated it's going to be. I mean, with a screenplay, you have 100 pages. Can you play this out in 100 pages? Or do you need like to stretch your legs like you can do in a novel? Are you going to require continual access to that interior space to really sort of complete characterization to the lengths it needs to be done? I mean, there's myriads of questions, and these are sorts of things that sometimes we understand implicitly, and sometimes it bears sort of asking yourself, what genre is it going to be in? Is it similar to anything else? That might be something worth asking. Just because you think there's a lot of dialogue, I don't think that necessarily means it's better suited for a screenplay. Sometimes it's the opposite. So I think instead it comes down to what will best serve character. And even, you know, when you have these films which are incredibly entrenched in their particular genre and they're all about action, you still need your audience gunning for characters. I mean, look at Marvel. Look at the massive Marvel enterprise. I mean, yes, they're just like plot, 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 and you're working off archetypes, but people care about those archetypes, right? They care about Captain America and his journey. So you need to still have character central to whatever it is you're writing. And then it comes down to, okay, do I want to explore this in a written form, or is this a problem for that character that I can solve in 100 pages?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really, really insightful. We've got another question, which I think is also terrific. It's from Kristen O'Carroll. Has writing a screenplay changed or impacted the way that you write novels?
Yeah, I think it has actually. That is a really good question. I think it's made me a lot less precious, and a little bit more willing to trust in the rewriting process. So by not being as precious, I mean that once it's written, I think it has to stay. So in other words, I've become a bit better at killing my darlings, but also, you know, creating more darlings, and looking at a creative work, certainly before it's published, as something which, you know, throw in a rabbit, throw in something crazy and see if it works. Whereas I think before that, I'd try and plot that out, or I'd try and think it through too far ahead. And now I like surprising myself as a writer. And I think because you need to do that, you know, although within a very sort of structured form within screenwriting, it's a nice thing to bring to novels. Also, you know, ways to symbolically, I guess, also explore the, you know, the particular sort of trajectories of my characters change as well. You know, how just because symbol is so beautifully used in visual storytelling and in cinema, how can I bring some of those elements back? So it's kind of rooting things much more in scene. It's kind of taking sometimes things out of the mind, out of that interior space, even though I still love exploring that, and thinking, oh, how else can I convey this in this novel in a way that, you know, the reader is still seeing it in their mind. And I think there's a reason Devotion is quite different to my two other novels, and I would credit that with involvement in screenwriting.
Fascinating. One last quick question from me. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but then I'm afraid we do need to wrap things up. But you were talking about dialogue before, and I've always been interested in the way screenwriters produce dialogue. As novelists in particular, there's the encouragement to create authentic dialogue, quote unquote, you know, if such a thing sort of exists in the space of fiction, because it's, you know, everything is kind of contrived in the world of the story. But how did you, if you can describe to us, how did you sort of sit down and construct the dialogue in the film? Because it's distinctly Australian. Perhaps it's Sarah Snook's kind of accent and the way that you know, her kind of, it seemed very familiar to me. And I think especially if you're a parent of a child who's about sort of 6 or 7 years old, a lot of their kind of exchanges, not so much the otherworldly, I have a different set of parents and you're not my mother, but you know, their exchanges felt incredibly real to me. How did you come about? Are you sort of sitting there at the desk, you know, speaking out these lines yourself? How is it that you kind of capture that cadence that we then see reflected in the film itself?
That's a good question. Again, just through the drafting process,
Mhm.
I think the longer you work, the more you form an ear for things. And I think in order to sort of exercise that ear, you need to read your own work aloud. And I do. I do that for novels and I do it for screenplays. But I think if it jars or if it feels false or if it just like the rhythm's not quite right, if it doesn't feel natural. I mean, this is one of the reasons I don't work in cafes, is because I have to read everything out loud. But you get a sense of it, and I tend to overwrite and then I will cut back, and that somehow will stop me just deliberating about whether or not to put something in. I'll put it in and I think, oh, maybe that will work, maybe that won't, and then inevitably by the time I come back I'm like, nah, cut it, because I've lost that sort of, you know, investment in the moment. But also it is Sarah Snook, it is absolutely her acting. You know, I think actors bring, I mean, they bring so much. I mean, they're not, you know, robots just reciting dialogue. They're bringing their entire arsenal of ability to it, whether that be gesture, whether that be emphasis. I mean, it's really interesting to see the film, like even to be there. I was there on set for some of the internal shots for within this particular house, which is out in Waikerie. And it was so fascinating to me. In many ways, I felt like I was hearing it new. Like I didn't even realize that I had written those lines, because they're conveyed in a way that, you know, was nothing like how I had said it in my little study at home. It was much better, which is also, you know, much faith and trust involved in writing this. But you want to give them material to work off or riff off. And sometimes between takes, they'll change it too. And you have to trust that they know what they're doing.
Terrific. Last question, because it segues nicely to a reminder about your online course with Kill Your Darlings. This is a question from Amelia, who asks, what advice do you have for someone starting, wanting to start out as a writer, screenwriter specifically? What key steps or strategies did you feel were most useful in the early stages of drafting, getting ideas off the ground? I mean, obviously you spoke a little bit about how you worked in tandem with the producer, but do you have any kind of writing tips or a routine or that process that you could share with you know, inspiring screenwriters in the audience?
I mean, it's funny. I feel like maybe my response might be different from people who have studied it at university. I mean, so much of what I feel I have learned. I mean, it's one of the reasons why in this course I've tried to I've tried to basically be like, don't make the mistakes I did. But I had to kind of quickly acquire a lot of knowledge in a very short period of time. And for that reason, I think my first advice would be to do what any writer should do, irrespective of the genre you want to work in, which is to read what other people are doing. I think so much of what you learn while reading is kind of absorbed, you know, on a subconscious level. You start to get a feel for it, which then means that you can trust your gut a little bit better when you are writing. So reading screenplays, reading books about craft, reading books about screenwriting, reading other things too, not just reading screenplays, looking at novels, looking at short stories, getting a sense. And in those readings, I think, yes, having a specific focus on ways in which character is represented and how characters change and how they are frustrated. And in doing so, you'll start to get an understanding of the ways in which character and plot are inextricably linked. And that, you know, whether or not it's an external sort of frustration or an external conflict that the character has to deal with, essentially it comes down to who they are as a person. So for me, it always comes back down to character. And I thought that was a novelist thing, but the more conversations I have with other producers, the more producers I meet, even in, you know, full Hollywood producers, they're like, we want character. It always comes down to that, but it can't be character in isolation. It can't be, you know, 100 pages of just, you know, a character profile. You need to put them in difficult situations and you need to understand how that works. So I think that would probably be where I would start, would be reading, but reading with a, you know, a real lens to character, and the ways in which what they want is frustrated, and the ways in which that then creates the plot points of the material.
That's terrific. Wonderful advice. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. Hannah, thank you so much for sharing these insights and experiences and being really candid with us. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope all our guests in the Zoom have too. Thank you for the questions that came through. Just a quick reminder, as we've spoken about a couple of times through the chat tonight, Hannah has a course on screenwriting currently being promoted by Killia Darlings. It's called Introductory to Screenwriting. If you're a KYD member, you're eligible for a discount. That discount offer ends on Sunday. Wishing everyone all the best with their screenwriting endeavours and their appreciation of film. And Hannah, can't wait to see the adaptations of the novels in the years ahead on our screens. And thanks once again for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you got something from it.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Good night.